fighting that we never look back. Here we go, 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 let us heal and grow. You won't be alone, we're unstoppable. Don't be afraid to show what we're going for. This is what we know. Here we come back to life, we're still breathing. Standing up, everybody's gonna see it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. Even if we fall, we will rise up and we follow the path that we believe in. No, we're not gonna stop until we reach it. Oh, all you need to know is that we're holding on. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne. We rise up from the dust and claim our throne.
All right, everybody. Time for some more reading from the Hiram Key. I'll get my spectacles on here. Hopefully they're clean enough to read through. All right. We're on to chapter 6 and 7 tonight. So I hope everybody's enjoying the read. I am. All right. Chapter 6. In the beginning, man made God. The Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden, that's the title, the subtitle there. Having decided that we needed to understand the history and evolution of Jewish religious beliefs, we turned our attention to something vital to all civilizations: language. The evidence is that most languages of the Indian subcontinent, Western Asia, Europe, and parts of North Africa stem from a common ancient source. The commonalities of hundreds of tongues have proven the point. It seemed to us that the same might apply to religion, because as people spread out, taking their languages with them, they're bound to have taken their legends and their gods as well. The connections between apparently different religions can, we believe, reveal linkages just as clear as those found by philologists, those who study the development of language. The origins of language have been sought for thousands of years. Many early people supposed that language was of divine origin, and that if one could discover the first or purest form of speech, one would have found the lexicon of the gods. Many experiments have been conducted to find this primeval language, including one by Psamtik I, Pharaoh of Egypt in the 7th century BC, who had 2 children brought up to hear no spoken word in hope that they would instinctively develop the pure and godlike language. They are said to have spontaneously spoken Phrygian, an ancient language from Asia Minor. The same experiment was carried out more than 2,000 years later by King James IV of Scotland, with the resulting language being equally unconvincingly Hebrew. The first language from which virtually all subsequent languages of the Old World sprang has been labeled rather unpoetically Proto-Indo-European. This has been shown to be the common source of Urdu, French, Punjabi, Persian, Polish, Czech, Gaelic, Greek, Lithuanian, Portuguese, Italian, Afrikaans, Old Norse, German, and English, amongst many others. How long ago Proto-Indo-European was a living single language we will never know, because our detailed knowledge of the past relies on the next great evolutionary step that grew out of language, and that is the written word. The book of Genesis was first written down around 2,700 years ago, well after the time of King Solomon. Ancient though this is, we now know that writing began more than twice as far back in history in a land called, rather beautifully, Sumer. Sumer is the accepted birthplace of civilization. Its writing, theology, and building technology formed the foundation of all later Middle Eastern and European cultures, although no one is sure where the Sumerians came from. They believed that they had come from a land called Dilmun, which is generally held to be modern-day Bahrain, on the west coast of the Persian Gulf. By 4000 BC, they had a thriving existence in what is now southern Iraq between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The broad alluvial plains provided rich agricultural land on which to grow crops, raise cattle, and the rivers abounded with fish to catch. By the 4th millennium BC, Sumer had a well-established culture that had cities, specialized craftsmen, cooperative irrigation works, ceremonial centers, and written records. City cultures are very different to those found in villages, as concentrations of large numbers of people demand a sophisticated social structure, with the majority of the workforce removed from agricultural production without loss of productivity. The Sumerians developed excellent farming techniques, and it has been calculated from texts in cuneiform scripts that their yield of wheat 4,400 years ago would compare favorably with the best of modern wheat fields of Canada. Besides establishing a highly efficient agriculture and such basic industries as the making of textiles and ceramics, the Sumerians invented new materials, including glass, and became outstanding glaziers as well as metalworkers using gold, silver, copper, and bronze. They became accomplished stone carvers and creators of delicate filigree work and carpentry. Carpentry. No. Carpentry. But without doubt, the most important invention of these amazingly I'm stumbling a lot, sorry. Of these amazingly competent people was the wheel. Their achievements as builders were impressive. There are many important innovations, including the pillar, which was directly inspired by the trunk of the date palm. Their earliest cities were made up of mud brick buildings. These crumble in the course of a few generations, so another building would be erected on top of the old. Over the thousands of years of Sumerian civilization, this process of decay, collapse, and rebuild created large mounds that we call tells, many of which, as much as 60 feet in height, still exist. The wealth of the Sumerians attracted travelers from distant lands, who sought to trade their simple goods for the wonderful produce of this advanced civilization. In response, the Sumerians developed a whole class of international merchants with large warehouses for imports and exports. The Sumerians were in a good position to demand advantageous terms for their trading, and it is likely that the populace would have had access to the most exotic and splendid goods from the corners of the known world. Many of their raw materials were brought down the rivers in boats, which were then either sold or dismantled for their valuable wood. The only tree that grew locally was the date palm, and its wood was too flexible to use in general building. Sumer had no stone quarries, so when the Sumerians wished to construct in stone, cut blocks were shipped down the rivers and carried through their elaborate canal system to the required site. Boats could not travel upstream, so manufactured goods to pay for the purchase of raw materials had to be carried north by donkey. The horse was unknown in Sumer. The cities of Sumer. There were as many as 20 cities in the land of Sumer, the most important of which were Ur, Kish, Eridu, Lagash, and Nippur. Each was politically autonomous, with a king and a priesthood. For the Sumerians, the land was God's, without whose procreative power life would end. The king was a lesser earthbound god whose responsibility it was to ensure the productivity of the community. At the center of each city was their god's house, the temple from which the priests controlled every aspect of life in the community, including the dispensing of justice, land administration, scientific and theological learning, and religious ritual. The schools known as Eduba produced the professional classes who would start their education from a young age. They were expected to become proficient in writing and then to study a range of subjects including mathematics, literature, music, law, accountancy, surveying, and quantity surveying. Their development was oriented to produce well-read leaders of men. Whilst elements of the Sumerian language remain in use today, it was not the origin of Proto-Indo-European. In fact, it was one of the few tongues completely unconnected with this root language. Our interest in the Sumerians was to see if elements of their theology had been the common source of religious beliefs that had spread in the same way that language had done, developing to suit... Oh, we're in an ad. Okay, well, boy, it started early this time. I don't know why. That's annoying. I'll have to look at the settings. I didn't think I had any ads that started until like 30 minutes or so. We're not even 15 in. Okay, well, let's see, where were we? Restart that last sentence. Our interest in the Sumerians was to see if elements of their theology had been the common source of religious beliefs that had spread in the same way that language had done, developing to suit local preferences as it traveled but retaining an identifiable core. From the ruins of Nippur, archaeologists have recovered many thousands of tablets that record the history of its people. Their early writing started out, as far as we know, around 3500 BC, and in much the same way as language must have developed. Fundamental objects such as head, hand, and leg were the first items to be identified. These were easily recognized pictograms with a profile of the object, but quickly more symbolic words were created. The symbol for a man was an ejaculating penis, looking very much like a candle. From that came the word for a male slave, which was the candle shape with 3 triangles superimposed to represent hills. This denoted a stranger. Sumer had no hills, and the only resident non-Sumerian males were slaves. The marks they made were created by pushing a stick into wet clay, and this tended to give a broader indentation and deposit where the writing instrument started and finished a line. This triangular effect at each end of the line was later translated as a serif, the small marks that you can see on the extremities of the letters on this page. It is not just the stylistic treatment of our letters that stems from the land of Sumer. Our very alphabet owes it much. The letter A, for example, derives from the image of a bull's head, which was a near triangle with 2 of the sides being overlong, giving the impression of horns. This was first evolved by the Phoenicians, then entered early Greek, where it looked like a bull's head on its side. As for the Greeks, as the Greeks developed capitals in their alphabet, the letter A was rotated another 90 degrees and became alpha, a character very similar to our modern capital A, which is essentially a bull's head upside down. Today, the English language still contains a few almost pure Sumerian words, such as alcohol, cane, gypsum, myrrh, and saffron, as well as passing down to us, amongst other things, the wheel, glass, our alphabet, our divisions of the time of day, mathematics, the art of building. The Sumerians gave us something else, God. They also have provided us with the earliest written histories, and as Freemasons we were particularly interested in Sumerian references to Enoch, who is important in Masonic lore, and the Sumerian story of the Great Flood, which figures so largely in the ritual of the Masonic Ark Mariner's degree. Etymologists have shown that the story of the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis is the story of Sumer. Moreover, cities such as Ur, Larsa, and Haram, mentioned in the book of Genesis, were actually in the land of Sumer. Genesis gives us the creation story. Quote, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God said, Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind." End quote. Compare this to an abstract Compare this to an abstract from a Babylonian account of the creation known as Enuma Elish. From its first two words, meaning when on high, it was written down in both Babylonian and Sumerian nearly 1,000 years before Genesis, and survives almost complete on 7 cuneiform tablets. So, quote, "All lands were sea. Then there was a movement on the midst of the sea. At that time Eridu was made. Marduk laid a reed on the face of the waters. He formed dust and poured it out beside the reed, that he might cause the gods to dwell in the dwelling of their heart's desire. He formed mankind. With him the goddess Aruru created the seed of mankind. The beasts of the field and living things in the field he formed. The Tigris and the Euphrates he created and established in their place. Their name he proclaimed in goodly manner. The grass, the rush, and the marsh, the reed and the forest he created. The lands, the marshes, and the swamps. The wild cow and her young, the lamb of the fold. Orchards and forests. The he-goat and the mountain goat. The Lord Marduk built a dam beside the sea. Reeds he formed, trees he created, bricks he laid, buildings he erected, houses he made, cities he built. Erech he made." I don't know what that is. And that's end quote. This Mesopotamian epic of creation is without doubt the source of Genesis creation legend, and it attributes to God all of the good things brought into existence by the remarkable Sumerians. The references to buildings being created by God did not carry through into the Israelite story, because the nomadic nature of the Jews meant that the only cities they had lived in by the time the book of Genesis came to be written down had been built by others, often taken after the original inhabitants had been put to the sword. The God of Genesis, Yahweh, did not come into existence for several hundred years after the writing of these cuneiform tablets. According to many experts, the gods of later civilizations are developments of the Sumerian fertility and storm gods. Could this be true? Certainly the storm god had a large part to play in the land of Sumer and the legend of Noah. The Sumerians saw nature as a living entity, and the gods and goddesses were embodiments of the forces of that living land. Each had a part to play in the forces of nature. Some deities were responsible for the fertility of the land and its people. Others took responsibility for organizing the storms which occurred. It was obviously important for the continuance of the people that the favor for the fertility gods should be actively sought. Equally, given the devastating effects of their labors, the storm gods had to be placated to preserve the Sumerian way of life. It would have been a storm god with power over the weather who caused the great flood, which gave rise to the story of Noah. And as Freemasons, we were naturally interested in storm gods and floods, since the craft devotes a whole side degree, the Ark Mariner's degree, with a complete and detailed ritual to preserve the story of Captain Noah and the legend of the flood. The one major problem that the people of Sumer had to contend with was the flooding of the low plains through which the Tigris and the Euphrates flowed south to the sea. Periodically, the flooding would be disastrous, but on one particular occasion it must have been unusually cataclysmic, and so entered folklore for all time. Whether or not a boat builder called Noah actually existed, we cannot know, but we can be sure that the Great Flood did happen. Be interesting to see what they think about Randall Carlson and his theories now. Further analysis of Genesis, especially the genealogy of Seth and Cain, clearly traces the creation story back to Sumer. There are lists of Sumerian kings from Larsa which name 10 kings who reigned before the flood and give the length of their reigns, ranging from 10,000 to 60,000 years. The Larsa list ends with the words, "After the flood kingship was sent down from on high." This suggests that a new beginning was made after the flood. The last name in the second Larsa list is Ziusundra, which is another name for Utnapishtim, the hero of the Babylonian story of the flood, written on the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. The seventh king in the Sumerian list was regarded as possessing special wisdom in matters pertaining to the gods and as being the first man to practice prophecy. That seventh name is Enoch, of whom Scripture says he walked with God, and who in later Jewish tradition was held to have been taken to heaven without dying. It seemed to us that there could be little doubt that the writer of Genesis was using Sumerian material which had passed into early Jewish tradition. The links between the religion of the Jews and the ancient land of Sumer are clear, but the situation becomes even more intriguing when we look at the reason why the original writer, or the Yahwist, using his material, assigned such longevity to Seth's descendants before the flood. We suspect it was to emphasize the contrast between the conditions of life before and after the divine judgment of the flood. There is, however, another possible reason. It has been suggested by some writers that the astronomical numbers in the Sumerian king lists may be the product of astrological speculations, which applied measurements derived from the observation of the stars to the calculation of mythical regnal periods. Regnal? I don't know, Regnal. I am not familiar with that word. In the same way, the early Jewish writers may have arranged the numbers of the lists to correspond with a chronology which assigned a fixed number of years from the creation to the foundation of Solomon's temple, and divided this period into epochs, the first of which, from the creation to the flood, contained 1,656 years. Ur, the city of Abraham. Ur, famous today for its great ziggurat, was looked upon in the 3rd millennium BC as one of the great city-states of the world. The northern and western sides of the city had major canals that brought ships in from the Euphrates and the sea, which was much closer to the city 4,400 years ago than it is now. One surviving bill of loading lists gold, copper ore, hardwoods, ivory, pearls, and other precious stones in a single cargo. Ur was at its finest under Ur-Namah in around 2100 BC, when large parts of the city were rebuilt and developed, and supported a population of as many as 50,000 people. The Great Ziggurat was enlarged and inset with mosaics and planted with shrubs and trees. At the summit was the temple of the city's own deity, Nana, god of the moon. In 2000 BC, the inhabitants incurred the wrath of their god because, along with 16 other Sumerian cities, Ur was sacked by Elamites. This defeat, like all others, was put down to the people failing their god in some way, and he in turn leaving them unprotected from their enemies. The destruction was described by a scribe who witnessed the terrifying occasion. Quote, in all its streets where there were wont to promenade, dead bodies were lying about. In its places where the festivities of the land took place, the people lay in heaps. End quote. Temples and houses were pulled to the ground, valuables looted, and many of those who not killed were taken into slavery. The city survived, but never truly regained its former glory, and by the 18th century BC, Ur was a relatively minor city. During this period of decline, the relationship between the Sumerians and the pantheon of gods became strained, and the concept of personal gods grew in importance. These personal gods, who were usually nameless, related directly to the individual, what we might call a guardian angel. A person would inherit their god from his father, so when someone said that he worshiped the god of his fathers, he was not making a general statement about the status of the god. He was expressing his individual family identity, his birthright. This personal god would look after him and take his cause to the greater gods when necessary, but he demanded obedience and close attention in return. Should the man behave badly, his god might desert him. The man was, of course, the arbiter of what was right and wrong. If he felt he had done wrong, he would be in fear of his god's reaction, but if he did something that all the world except himself thought was wicked, he was safe. This seems like a very good means of controlling most bad behavior, along the lines of Jiminy Cricket's catchphrase in the film Pinocchio, always let your conscience be your guide. Hey, Vesper. How you doing, man? Good to see you. Welcome in. At some point in the period of decline between 2000 and 1800 BC, a man called Abram decided to leave his city of Ur and head northwards in search of a better life. The direction he chose was almost the opposite direction to that of Dilmun, the sacred land his people aspired to, and the land of their ancestors. At some point in Jewish history, Abram became Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. It was clear to us that the ideas that he took with him from Ur must be an important part of what we needed to learn. I'm good, a bit tired, so I figured I would take the night off. Well, that's I can fully relate to that. There have been nights I just was not up for streaming at all, so I've done the same thing. So sit back and enjoy. We had been prompted to look so far back in time in the hope of gaining a better understanding of both Abraham and his God, as together they represent the earliest encounter in the Bible between a real man, as opposed to a mythical character, and the deity that became the God of the Jews. Neither of us knew very much about the land of Sumer beforehand. Indeed, this whole period of history was totally unknown to anyone until the middle of the 19th century when P.E. Boda, a French archaeologist, started to uncover major finds in the area now known as Mesopotamia. The spread of Sumerian culture must have occurred more than 5,000 years ago. One of the best known examples of this cultural development from a North African / Southwest Asian origin is the Celts, who moved throughout Central Europe and finally settled in coastal areas of western Spain, Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland, where some social groups remain genetically undiluted by the virtual absence of intermarriage with other peoples. Their knotted, intertwining designs show a strong relationship to art of the Middle East, and if there was any doubt remaining, DNA analysis of some modern-day Celts from remote communities have been shown to be a match with North African tribal groups. No one knows for sure how long Sumer had existed, but from the records that we have consulted, it seems reasonable to believe that everything we know of Sumer post-dates the flood. Many of the towns and cities were probably even greater before the deluge struck them off the face of the earth. God, the king, the priest, and the builders. The flood is recorded as an ancient happening even to those that are themselves ancient to us. The Bible tells the story of Noah surviving with his family and assorted animals. In a Mesopotamian flood myth, King Utnapishtim saves seeds as well as animals from the destructive flood, sent by Enlil to terrorize other gods. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and or Deucalion, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I'll say Deucalion, and his wife Pyrrha built the ark to escape the devastating wrath of Zeus. Did you look into any of those Charles Murray books? Yes, I did, and I actually found several of them. So I'm going to work him into the rotation of reading. I haven't decided which one yet, but I will be reading something. So yeah, I think I picked up maybe half a dozen of his books, including the Bell Curve, and I'm blanking on the names of the other ones right at the moment. But yeah, I will definitely be reading some of his stuff. I'm also going to get back to Plato eventually, but I've got one more book after this I want to read, and then I think I'm going to go back and read um, The Republic. I'm reading Coming Apart. Coming Apart. Oh yeah, okay, yeah. That might be one of them I found. I can't remember. I honestly can't remember. I know I got the Bell Curve, but I don't remember the names of the other ones. I got them in electronic format, so they're not right out in front of me. Okay. Um, Built the ark, escaped his death. Okay. Guessing is no longer the only way forward. The evidence of a major flood just over 6,000 years ago has been found around Ur, where a layer of water-laid clay 2.5 meters deep covers an area of more than 100,000 square kilometers. This amounts to a spread across the entire width of the Tigris and Euphrates Valley from north of modern Baghdad to the coast of the Persian Gulf in what now includes parts of Iraq, Iran, and Kuwait. To leave such a deposit, the flood must have been of gigantic proportions and would certainly have swept away human culture throughout what would later be the land of Sumer. This dating for the flood explains why the Sumerians seem to have appeared from nowhere in around 4000 BC, virtually overnight in archaeological terms. A full-blown and sophisticated culture without any history or evidence of origins elsewhere is indeed mysterious. It'll be interesting when we get to later books in this series whether or not these guys have taken into account the very sudden end of the Younger Dryas that we now know about that was 11,500 years ago. I think that's total. That's not BC. That's total. So it's 9,500 years BC, which is maybe okay. Maybe they're roughly in the ballpark of each other from what they're saying here. But it is a mystery with a simple solution. The answer is that the earlier and perhaps even greater period in the history of Sumer was all but lost in the cataclysm, and the surviving Sumerians had to rebuild everything from the foundations upwards. The main problem that confronted the remaining people was to find survivors who had been keepers of royal secrets, those who had been high priests of the vanished temples and therefore may have the power of science, especially the science of building. Some must have survived. Perhaps their knowledge of the hidden mysteries of nature and science afforded them sufficient warning of the coming flood, giving them time to head for high ground or indeed build an ark. Whilst the secrets and symbolism of building predated the flood, we believe that the sudden and urgent need to reconstruct the whole world created a new outlook based on building the square, level, and upright foundations of a new order. We are not claiming that this was Freemasonry in any form, but it did give rise to the connection between the science of Masonry and the concept of resurrection, as the world itself had undergone death and once again had been raised out of the waters of creation. Many people may have found the rebuilding of Sumer too challenging and left the region in search of a new home away from the soft, wet clay that covered their land. They carried with them their language, which was as sophisticated in grammatical structure as many today. In addition, they took the knowledge of farming, the story of their buildings, and their gods and their myths. To less advanced people of Europe and Asia, they must have seemed like gods themselves. Our problem in writing the story of our investigation is the breadth of topics that we had to dig into, all apparently unrelated, but in fact heavily interlinked. At times, our studies were buried in source material that ranged from the beginning of time to the modern day. Putting everything we found into some sort of intelligible sequence has provided a challenge, but the more information we collated, the clearer the picture became. This was especially true for matters relating to Sumer. The more we looked for the influences upon other cultures, the more we found. This book cannot deal with them all, but we give you just one example to show how extraordinary the role of this culture has been. The concept of a pillar or holy mountain connecting the center of the earth with the sky, heaven, is a Sumerian concept that has found its way into many belief systems, including those of northern Asia. The Tartars, Mongols, Buryat, and the Kalmyk peoples of northern Asia possess a legend that claims their holy mountain was a stepped building consisting of 7 blocks, each one smaller than the last as it rises up toward the sky. Its summit is the pole star, the navel of the sky, that corresponds to the base below, the navel of the world, of the earth. The structure describes no building known to these tribesmen, but it does fit the description of a Sumerian ziggurat, which was created as an artificial mountain. We can be certain that this connection is no coincidence, because the name that these northern nomads give to this sacred mythical tower is simply Sumer. Whilst all Sumerian people, while all Sumerian temples are believed to have followed this format, the most famous of them all is known to us as the Tower of Babel, the great building closely associated with the descendants of Noah. This tower was built in Babylon by Nabopolassar and was a 7-story ziggurat some 300 feet in height, with a shrine to the god Marduk on its summit. Like the story of the flood, the story of the Tower of Babel was written down in the book of Genesis by combining different versions of ancient legends and allowing the authors to make sense of the way they found the world. Chapter 10 of Genesis deals with Chapter 10 of Genesis deals with peopling of the countries of the earth after the flood, explaining how the sons of Noah gave rise to new tribes in each part of the world. For the Hebrews, the most important of these sons was Sem, who gave rise to the peoples known as Semites in the course of his impressive 600-year life, which of course include the Jewish people. The next chapter of Genesis tells the story of the Tower of Babel, starting by acknowledging that there was once only one language. It begins, quote, "And the earth was of one tongue and of the same speech. And when they removed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Sennar," Hebrew for Sumer, "and dwelt in it. And each one said to its neighbor, Come, let us make brick and bake them with fire. And they had brick instead of stones, and slime instead of mortar. And they said, Come, let us make a city and a tower, the top thereof may reach the heaven. And let us make our name famous, because we may be scattered abroad into all lands. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of Adam were building. And he said, Behold, it is one people, and all have one tongue, and they have begun to do this. Neither will they leave off from their designs, till they have accomplished them indeed. Come ye, therefore, let us go down, and there confound their tongue, that they may not understand one another's speech. And so the Lord scattered them from that place into all lands, and they ceased to build the city. End quote. I want to pick up some soul books now. Yeah, absolutely. Like you can't go wrong. And they're so far, I've read two of his books, and they're very short. They're like 6, 7 chapters. One was 5 chapters. The first book I read. So they're a good short read. You'd get through them pretty quickly, I think. This neat bit of rationalization made clear to the Jews why it was that people spoke different languages. And because the world had been an empty wilderness before God decided to repopulate it through the line of Noah, it was entirely reasonable that he could promise the land of Canaan to the sons of Sem without a thought for the people there, because the people there before them. From his beginnings in Sumer, God took different pathways to the valleys of the Nile, the Indus, and possibly even the Yellow River, giving rise to the great religions of the world. All this happened in very ancient times, and one of the very latest variations of Sumerian theology was the god of the... okay. All this happened in very ancient times, and one of the very latest variations of Sumerian theology was the god of the Jews. I've actually heard a variation on that, of it being Zoroastrian specifically. The figure of Abraham, the first Jew. Once Abraham had made the decision to leave Ur, the natural direction was northwards up the route of the two rivers in search of a new home in which he would be at peace with his God. The Old Testament tells us that until Abraham arrived on the scene, the ancestors of Israel, quote, served other gods, end quote. Joshua 24:2, which is hardly surprising, as Yahweh, the God of the Jews and eventually Christians, was as far in the future for them as the personal computer was for William Caxton. Even after Yahweh had made himself known to his chosen people, allegiance to him was at best patchy for almost 1,000 years. Other gods of all descriptions were just as popular. When the time came for the Israelites to write down the history and heritage of their people, they looked back through immense periods of time and confirmed ancient oral traditions by fitting in the details that should have been. Abraham was probably prompted to leave his native city of Ur because the godless nomads from the north that were taking over daily life were no longer acceptable to him. At that time, political discontent would always be expressed as theological discontent. The Bible states that Abraham came out from man-made order where the rule of God had been rejected. This refers to the unseating of God's representatives upon earth, the king of Ur and his priests. His books hold their value as well. Can't find any under $10 used on Amazon. Yep, that is very true. Abraham is generally considered to be the first historical figure in the Bible. By contrast, Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, and Noah are representatives of peoples and times that embody early Hebrew ideas and traditions concerning the beginnings of life on earth. It is probably true that he went on to travel to the land of Canaan, passing himself off as a tent dweller, and en route having heavy discussions with his personal god, who naturally traveled with him from Sumer. The description of Abraham as a nomad like themselves makes a lot of sense, as he and the people who traveled with him were without a land to call their own. The name Hebrew, we discovered, derives from the term Habiru, which was apparently a derogatory term, sometimes also known as Apiru, used by the Egyptians to describe the Semitic tribes that wandered like the Bedouin. As we saw above, the history of the Jews claims descent from Sem, the son of Noah, who was himself a character from Sumerian legend, and later from Abraham, who left Sumer to find the Promised Land. Given that there is no trace of these dwellers of the land of Sumer, we feel that many Sumerians must have trekked north and west to become a significant part of the wandering peoples that became the Jewish nation. However, all the evidence shows that the Jews are not a race or even a historical nation as they have come to believe. They are an amalgam of Semite groups who found commonality in their statelessness and adopted a theological history based on a Sumerian subgroup. Perhaps 1 in 10 of the Israelites at the time of David and Solomon was of Sumerian stock, and a tiny fraction of this number were descendants of Abraham, who logically was not the only Sumerian to travel into Canaan and Egypt during the second half of the second millennium BC. The Haribu were identifiable from the nomads who had existed in Egypt because they were Asiatics, who wore strange clothes, were bearded, and spoke in an alien tongue. Abraham is considered to be the key to the founding of Israel, with his God promising him a new home for his people in the land later identified as part of the northern Fertile Crescent called Canaan. Given the nature of Sumerian deities outlined above, it is likely that Abraham was a priest with a particular god who was his companion and guardian. The average Jew or Christian reading the Old Testament can be forgiven for thinking that the land of Canaan was a rightful gift of God to his chosen people, but the eventual taking of this promised land was nothing less than theft. If the words of the Old Testament are to be taken at face value, then the Jews and their God were nothing less than wicked. No supernatural justification can excuse the slaughter of so many of the original inhabitants, which is what the Old Testament claims happened. Lands get conquered all the time, man. Most Christians today have a blurred and vague impression of the history of their God, who was first the God of the Hebrews. They imagine their all-powerful and loving God as promising his chosen people a beautiful land flowing with milk and honey, a kind of Sumer or Garden of Eden rediscovered, a land called Canaan. But Canaan was no uninhabited wilderness where noble wanderers could carve out a new homeland, and Yahweh was no sweet benefactor. He was a storm god, a god of war. Recent archaeological studies have revealed that the Canaanites, whose lands the Israelites seized, had an advanced civilization with walled cities and countless lesser towns and villages, and sophisticated systems of food production, manufacture, and world trade. If the stories contained in the Bible are accepted, then the original God of the Hebrews was in reality a figurehead who justified invasion, theft, and slaughter with much in common with Genghis Khan. It amazes us that many Christians believe that the Old Testament is a real historical record of events, despite the fact that it portrays God as a vain, vengeful maniac without a drop of compassion. Besides ordering the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children in the cities he ordained should be stolen from the indigenous population, he also was known to attack his friends with no apparent reason. In Exodus 4:24-25, we read that Yahweh decided to kill Moses shortly after commanding him to make his way to Egypt to rescue the enslaved Israelites. He was talked out of this particular piece of bad behavior by a woman that claimed Moses as her bridegroom. This was later rewritten in the apocryphal work Jubilees to move the blame from Yahweh to a spirit called Mastema, which is only a word meaning the hostile side of Yahweh's nature. However, it is clear that the book of Exodus, from the book of Exodus, that God did murder Moses' son when the mood took him. Whilst nobody has so far managed to date Abraham's travels with any certainty, it is widely accepted that he existed no earlier than 1900 BC and no later than 1600 BC. If he were at the later end of this period, He would have been right in the midst of the occupation of Egypt by the so-called Hyksos, or shepherd kings, who invaded and oppressed the Egyptians for over 200 years, from around 1786 to 1567 BC. By now, we had come to the view that there was a connection between Abraham and the Semites who occupied Egypt from the area of Jerusalem. History could start to make a lot of sense. Abraham had set out with his followers for Haran, a major city in modern Syria on the banks of the Balik River, which was on the trading route from Sumer up the Euphrates. From there, he took his group into the land of Canaan, which is, of course, Israel. Somewhere en route, Abraham became concerned that he had done some wrong because he felt that his personal God was unhappy with him. This was probably the way he rationalized a bad problem or incident that befell his group, translating the calamity as being the result of his God removing protection because he was vexed. So upset was Abraham's God, which equates to how big a problem faced them, that he felt that the only way out was to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. A passage in Micah 6:7 shows the seriousness of the situation. Quote, "Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" End quote. Okay, we're almost done with this chapter. This is a longer chapter than the others, I think. Twice in the story of Abraham, the words "after these things" appear. It has long been observed that these were the moments of major crisis where the God of Abraham was to be appeased. This was one of them. Fortunately for the young Isaac, the problem must have eased, and his deeply superstitious father changed his mind about the need to kill him. There is, however, a far later story that Isaac was sacrificed by Abraham, but subsequently resurrected, and Isaac, like Jesus the Christ, is portrayed as a suffering servant who brings salvation and redemption to others. Somewhere between 1300 and 1000 years passed before the story of Abraham was first written down, having been a tribal legend handed down by word of mouth for that immense period of time. When it came to be written, it seemed natural that Abraham's God must have been Yahweh, despite the fact that Yahweh was not introduced until the time of Moses. The terminology of Moses when he led the Israelites out of Egypt, telling them that his message came from the God of their fathers, is a uniquely Sumerian way of referring to a personal God that belongs to the offspring of Abraham. Whilst only a tiny fraction of these displaced Asiatics, proto-Jews, can have been descendants of Abraham, all of them by this time had bought into the legend and had adopted it as an acceptable and noble reason for their current circumstances. If Moses had stood in front of these slaves in Egypt and told them his message had come from Yahweh, or a God of the whole world who cancels out all other gods, he would have been thought mad. Unlike previous characters, Abraham did not become the source of a whole tribe that took the name. Instead, his personal God, the God of Abraham, became the distinguishing characteristic of his future people. We find it truly amazing that one Sumerian man's psyche has formed the basis for the three great monotheistic religions of the world. By now, our quest had led us to an understanding of the concept of a personal God and of people who drew their cultural heritage from a man who had left the Sumerian city of Ur, taking his personal God with him. Although we had found comment on a possible resurrection ceremony connected with Isaac, the son of the father of the Jews, this story seemed to be of much later origin. There were no links with Freemasonry to be found here, so we felt that before once again picking up the development of the Jewish people, we had to look at the greatest ancient civilization of them all, which sprang up around the Nile River. Abraham had spent time in Egypt during the formative period of the Jewish nation, and we were aware that later Jews had risen to prominence in the land of Egypt. ancient Egypt had to be the next object of our inquiries. Conclusion. It was only when we looked at the early development of God that we realized just how little we had ever been taught of early history. We had known nothing of the land of Sumer, the birthplace of civilization, and the place where writing and education first originated. The Sumerians, we had discovered, were the inventors of the pillar and the pyramid, which had spread far beyond their own land. The story of Genesis account of the flood turns out to be predated by nearly 1,000 years by the Sumerian account of creation known as the Enuma Elish. It was from the Sumerian city of Ur that Abraham came, bringing with him his personal god known as the God of his fathers, sometime between 2000 and 1600 BC. We had wondered whether Abraham could have had any connections or overlap with the Hyksos kings of Egypt, who ruled from 1786 to 1567 BC, but we did not have enough knowledge of the Egyptians to answer the question, and despite a few tantalizing hints of characters who figured in Freemasonry, we had found no other links at all to the modern craft. If we were ever to crack the puzzle, then we would have to come forward again in time and study the civilization of Egypt. And that is the end of that chapter. Let me see real quick how long this next chapter is. Oof. Okay, it's quite long. Let's see, 22 pages, which are 21 pages, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's different when you're reading it out loud. Okay. So, and that last one was, yeah, it's longer yet. So, the last one I read, chapter 6, was 16 pages. This one's 21, so it's going to be even longer. So we'll be past 2 hours again to get through this. I might have to pause somewhere in the middle of this chapter to go get some more water. Otherwise, my voice won't hold out. All right. Chapter 7, The Legacy of the Egyptians, the Beginnings of Egypt. The Egyptians are most famous for pyramids. As we were to find out, the legacy of this very special people goes far beyond ancient artifacts, as they were responsible for some major contributions to our modern way of life. Egyptians today are a mixture of Arab, Negro, and European racial types, creating a variety of skin tones and features. Many of these are strikingly beautiful, and some are identical to the images found in the ancient tombs within the pyramids. This beauty is not merely skin deep. They have also always been a friendly and, by all normal standards, a tolerant nation. The widespread idea that the wicked Egyptians used Hebrew slaves to build the pyramids is nonsense, not least because there were no Hebrews in existence at that early time. The earliest Egyptians must have been strongly influenced, if not entirely guided, by the city builders of Sumer. Perhaps after the Great Flood, some holders of the secrets and mysteries of building made their way northwards and westwards until they discovered another river-based people who sustained their life through a rhythmic and controlled flooding of the river's waters to bring goodness and moisture to the arid desert soil. As Egypt has a level of rainfall that cannot support crops, the Nile has always been central to the continuation of life there, and it is little wonder that this river has become virtually synonymous with Egypt. From the end of August to September, an annual inundation flows from the south to the Mediterranean in the north, depositing black mud from which the food of the nation will grow. Too much inundation in a year led to serious flooding, destroying homes and killing livestock and people. Too little meant no irrigation and therefore famine. The balance of life was dependent upon the generosity of the Nile. Ancient records show that when Egyptian soldiers had cause to chase their enemies into Asia, they were horrified at the conditions they found in places such as the Lebanon. Vegetation was reported to grow at will and to hamper the progress of the troops, and the Nile refusingly and the Nile confusingly fell from the sky instead of flowing from the hills. Those are two short quotes. Uh, this reference shows that they had no word for rain and that even this usually vital phenomenon can be unwelcome once you have learned to live without it. They were also disgusted at the temperature of the water they drank from the cool rivers, choosing to lay it out in bowls to warm in the sun before putting it to their lips. The Nile had supported small, isolated groups of nomadic hunters for tens of thousands of years, but during the course of the 4th millennium BC, farming settlements began to appear. These developed into proto-kingdoms with territorial boundaries to debate and protect. Fighting became common before there was a general realization that cooperation was more effective than aggression, and harmonious communities emerged. Sometimes before 3100 BC, a single kingdom was finally established with the unification of the two lands of Upper and Lower Egypt. The theology of the earliest periods of the United Kingdom was still. Oh, okay. I get that's why they didn't capitalize United Kingdom, because they're talking about the United Kingdom of Upper and Lower Egypt. Also, I thought they were suddenly flipping gears on me going, the United Kingdom, what the heck? The theology of the earliest periods of the United Kingdom was still fragmented, with each city retaining its original gods. Most people believed that in a time before memorial gods had lived in the same. It, wow, okay. Most people believed that in a time before memory, gods had lived in the same way that men do, with fears, hopes, weaknesses, and ultimately death. Gods were not immortal, let alone omnipotent. They aged and died with cemeteries set aside for them. This total mortality is clearly at odds with any definition of a god and raises the question as to why these earlier inhabitants were described as such. Our only guess is that the people who controlled the Nile region over 5,500 years ago were foreigners who possessed knowledge or technology which was so advanced compared to the indigenous population that they seemed to be capable of magic. In ancient times, magic and religion were inseparable, and any powerful person could easily be deemed to be a god. There is little point in speculating too much about such events lost in prehistory, but perhaps these living gods were the men who possessed the secrets of building that they passed on to the pyramid builders before leaving or dying out as a separate race. The Egyptians believed that matter had always existed. To them, it was illogical to think of a god making something out of absolutely nothing. Their view was that the world began when order came out of chaos, and that ever since there has been a battle between the forces of organization and disorder. The creation of order was brought about by a God who had always been. He was not only there before men, the sky, and the earth, he was in existence before the time of the gods. This chaotic state was called Nun, and like the Sumerian and biblical descriptions of pre-creation conditions, all was a dark, sunless, watery abyss with a power, a creative force within it that commanded order to begin. This latent power, which was within the substance of the chaos, did not know it existed. It was a probability, a potential that was intertwined within the randomness of disorder. Amazingly, this description of creation perfectly describes the view held by modern science, particularly chaos theory, which has shown intricate designs which evolve and mathematically repeat within completely unstructured events. It appears that the ancient Egyptians were closer to our physics-based worldview than seems possible for a people that had no understanding of the structure of matter. The details of this earliest time varied a little within the beliefs of each of the great cities. The most influential were, using their later Greek names, Memphis, Hermopolis, Crocodilopolis, Dodera, Esna, Edfu, and Heliopolis, the city of the sun, which had earlier been known as On. Central to the theology that underpinned these cities was a first moment in history when a small island or hill arose out of the watery chaos, fertile and ready to support life. In Heliopolis and Hermopolis, the spirit that had sparked life, bringing order, was the sun god Re, also known as Ra. Whereas in the great city of Memphis, he was identified as Ptah, the earth god. In either case, he was considered to have arrived at self-consciousness at the moment that he caused the first land to emerge from the waters. Re Ptah became the source of the material benefits that the Egyptians enjoyed, and he was the aspiration for all of the arts, the source of essential skills, and importantly, the mystery of building. Ooh, what do we got here? I might pick up Ethnic America, social justice fallacies, and a conflict of visions. All of them sound good. I have not read any of those three yet, but all three of them sound good, and they are definitely on my list. The rules of Egypt, first the kings and later the pharaohs, were the rulers, let me start that over. The rulers of Egypt, first the kings and later the pharaohs, were gods as well as men who ruled by divine right. Each king was the son of God, who at the point of death became at one with his father, to be God in a cosmic heaven. The story of the god Osiris tells how this cycle of gods and their sons began. The sky goddess Nut had 5 children, the eldest of whom was Osiris, who was himself both a man and a god. As became the norm in ancient Egypt, his sister became his consort. Her name was Isis. Helped by his right-hand god Thoth, he ruled the country wisely, and the people prospered. However, his brother Set was jealous of Osiris's success and murdered him, severing his body into pieces, which he cast into various parts of the Nile. Isis was distraught, especially as Osiris had produced no heir, which meant that the wickedness of Set would reward him with the right to rule. Being a resourceful goddess, Isis did not give in. She had the pieces of the body of Osiris located and brought to her so that she could magically have them reassembled and breathe a last brief moment of life into her brother. She then lowered herself onto the divine phallus, and the seed of Osiris entered her. With Isis now bearing his child, Osiris merged with the stars where he ruled the kingdom of the dead. Isis gave birth to a son called Horus, who grew up to become a prince of Egypt and later challenged his father's murderer to a duel. In the ensuing battle, Horus cut off Set's testicles, but lost an eye himself. Eventually, the young Horus was deemed to be the victor, and he became the first king. From that time on, the king was always considered to be the god Horus, and at the moment of his death he became Osiris, and his son the new Horus. The stability of the two lands. Upper and Lower Egypt were united as a single kingdom around 5,200 years ago. We do not know what problems the people experienced before this time, when the gods lived amongst them. From the start, the unification was held to be absolutely central to the well-being of the bipartite state. The building of the pyramids fulfilled the same need for the Egyptians as the stepped ziggurats had for the Sumerian people, in that they were artificial mountains that helped the king and his priests reach up toward the gods. But far more ancient than the pyramid was the pillar, which had the same function of reaching between the world of men and the world of the gods. Prior to unification, each of the two lands had its principal pillar to connect the king and his priests with the gods. It seems reasonable to assume that when Upper and Lower Egypt became two kingdoms in one, both pillars would have been retained. Each pillar was a spiritual umbilical cord between heaven and earth, and the Egyptians needed a new theological framework to express the relationship of their new trinity of two lands and one heaven. In the ancient city of Anu, later called On in the Bible and Heliopolis by the Greeks, there was a great sacred pillar itself named Anu, possibly before the city. What? Oh, okay. This, we believe, was the great pillar of Lower Egypt, and its counterpart in Upper Egypt at the time of unification was in the city of Nekeb. Later, the city of Thebes, known then as Waset, had the title Eunushema, which meant the southern pillar. Through analyzing later Egyptian beliefs and rituals, we believe that these sacred pillars became the physical manifestations of the unification, symbolizing the joining of the lands within one kingdom. The two pillars were considered united by the heavenly crossbeam of the sky god Nut, or Nut, whatever, N-U-T. So the three parts forming an architectural doorway. With one pillar in the south and the other in the north, the opening naturally faced east to greet the rising sun. In our opinion, this represented stability, and as long as both pillars remained intact, the kingdom of the two lands would prosper. We found it very pertinent to note that the Egyptian hieroglyph for the two lands, called Tawi, was what could be described as two eastward-facing pillars with dots to indicate the direction of the rising sun. So, I don't know, do I really need to show you this? I suppose I can. Ooh. Oh, I don't need to do anything there. It's just a very simple illustration there. Two lines with three dots below each line. Facing the spiritual doorway from the east, the right-hand pillar was the one in Lower Egypt, corresponding with the Masonic right-hand pillar Hakin, which represents to establish. There is no explanation in the modern ritual as to what this is supposed to mean, but it seems to us that it stems right back to Lower Egypt, the older of the two lands. According to Egyptian myth, it was the place where the world first came into existence from the primordial chaos called Nun, and therefore Hakin represents both nothing less than the establishment of the world. For the Egyptians, the left-hand pillar marked the connection with heaven for Upper Egypt, and in Masonic ritual it is identified as Boaz, which is said to mean strength, or in it is strength. As we will demonstrate in the next chapter, this association arose when the land of Upper Egypt showed great strength at the time of Egypt's greatest need, at a time when Lower Egypt was temporarily lost to a powerful enemy. Freemasonry states that the unification of the two pillars represents stability, and there is no doubt that that describes how the Egyptians felt. As long as both pillars were intact, the kingdom of the two lands would prosper. This theme of strength through the unity of two pillars was, we believe, the beginning of a concept that would be adopted in many forms by later cultures, including the Jews and ultimately Freemasonry. When studying the history of Egypt, we quickly came across an ideal that was absolutely central to their civilization. It was a concept called Ma'at. In the light of our research, you can imagine the amazement and excitement we felt when we found the following definition. Quote, what characterized Egypt was the need for order. Egyptian religious beliefs had no great ethical content, but in practical matters there was a general recognition that justice was a good so fundamental that it was part of the natural order of things. Pharaoh's adjuration to the vizier on his appointment made that much clear. The word used, ma'at, signified something more comprehensive than fairness. Originally, the word was a physical term. It meant level, ordered, and symmetrical, like the foundation plan of a temple. Later, it came to mean righteousness, truth, and justice. End quote. Could there ever be a clearer and more succinct description of Freemasonry? As Freemasons ourselves, we don't think so. Freemasonry considers itself to be a peculiar system of morality based on brotherly love, relief, and truth. The newly made Mason is told the all squares and levels are sure and certain signs by which to know a Mason. Freemasonry is not a religion in the same way that the concept of Ma'at was not an integral part of some theological structure or legend. Both are pragmatic realizations that the continuance of civilization and social progress rests upon the individual's ability to, quote, do unto others as you would be done to, end quote. The fact that both use the design and building of a temple as an example and observe that human behavior should be on the level and upright is surely beyond coincidence. It is rare to find a moral code in any society that exists outside of a religious system, and it is fair to say that Ma'at and Masonry, stone for stone, level for level, are a match that could teach the modern world a great deal. As we started really to appreciate the strengths and beauties of Ma'at, we felt more and more that Freemasonry in its current form was a poor descendant, if descendant it be. Perhaps people at Grand Lodge identify with the real values that are indisputably within the craft, but we are afraid to say that in our experience precious few work-a-day Freemasons have a clue of the social splendor with which they are associated. In our modern Western world, decent human values such as pity and charity have become confused with religion, often being described as Christian values, which is a great shame. Many Christians are of course good and giving people, but we would suggest that this is more to do with their personal spirituality than any theological requirement. Conversely, some of the most horrible, inhuman acts of history have been carried out in the name of Christianity. Whilst we are dwelling on modern equivalents of Ma'at, we cannot help but observe that many socialists and communists might consider themselves as non-theological seekers of human goodness and equality. If they do, they are wrong. Like a religion, their creed demands adherence to a preordained methodology for their goodness to work. Ma'at was pure goodness, freely given. It would seem reasonable to us to say that if Western society ever reaches its broad-based objective of equality and stability, it will finally have rediscovered Ma'at. If modern engineers marvel at the hard-to-emulate skills of the pyramid builders, then what can our social scientists make of a concept like this? By now we have realized that the link between Masonic values and those of Ma'at was getting hard to deny. Certainly, some might claim that Masonry was a fanciful 17th century invention that styled itself on the concept of Maat. We felt that that argument does not stand up, as Egyptian hieroglyphics could not be understood until the Rosetta Stone, which translated some hieroglyphics into Greek, was deciphered, 100 years after the Grand Lodge of England was established. Before then, there was no obvious way that Freemasonry could have known about Maat in order to model itself upon it. In ancient Egypt, we had found a civilization which preached the principles we had learned from the ritual of Freemasonry, and which also seemed to use a concept of two pillars within its civil structure. There was also a murder and resurrection story linked with the name of Osiris, and it was not connected to the architect of King Solomon's temple or even any other temple. We obviously needed to look at the civilization of the ancient Egyptians in much more detail. Excuse me. The Egyptians had experienced the limitations of self-seekingness during their formative period, and they strove through the genius of the one all-embracing idea that was Maat to build a new order that would be fit for man and the gods. The future temperament of the Egyptian people has, it seems, been shaped by this spirit of tolerance and friendship. In ancient times, Ma'at became a basis for the legal system and soon came to stand for all rightness, from the equilibrium of the universe and all heavenly bodies to honesty and fair dealing in daily life. In, a, in ancient Egyptian society, thought and nature were understood as two sides of the same reality. Whatever was regular or harmonious in either was considered to be a manifestation of Ma'at. We were aware from our Masonic studies that the appreciation of all that is regular and harmonious is central to all Freemasonry, and the right to investigate the hidden mysteries of nature and science is bestowed upon the fellow craft or second-degree Freemason. The story of Set and Osiris we outlined earlier demonstrated to the people of Egypt that the divine rule of legitimate kings could not be broken, even by the powers of disruption and anarchy that Set represented. The concept of Maat became the hallmark of a good king, and ancient records show that every king and pharaoh was described as he that does Maat, protector of Maat, or he that lives through Maat. Social order and the balance of justice cascaded down from the fountainhead of Maat, from the living god Horus, the king. Only through the preservation of the divine line of kings could the civilization of Egypt survive. This presentation of Maat and the royal line being inseparable was clearly an excellent mechanism to avoid rebellion and maintain the monarchy. Not only was the political stability of the country sustained through the embracing of Maat, the nation's entire prosperity relied upon it. If the people lived their lives according to Maat, the gods would ensure that the Nile brought with it just sufficient flooding to provide the crops to feed the population. Too little or too much flooding would be the fault of the people and the king. Living by Ma'at also ensured victory in war. Enemies of the country were viewed as forces of chaos and would be dealt with because the gods supported the good people of Ma'at. Eventually, Ma'at was perceived as a goddess. She was the daughter of the sun god Re, and sailed across the sky with him in a boat, and she is often depicted as standing at the bow, ensuring that a true and perfect course is maintained. Ma'at is shown with an ostrich feather in her headdress and an ankh hanging from each arm. The ankh was and is the symbol of life. Its form is a crucifix with the top section split down the middle and opening up to form the shape of an eye or boat in a vertical position. A further very significant discovery for us was that Maat's brother was the moon god Thoth, who is often shown to be shown at the bow of Re's boat alongside Maat. Our interest arose after we found references to the fact that Thoth was an important figure in certain early Masonic legends. It was Thoth who taught the Egyptians the art of building and religion and was said to establish what is true. The king that fought evil was said to be a good god, an heir to Thoth. And I think Thoth is the god of knowledge, if I remember right. Okay, I think you've got a ways to go. You know, holy shit, ways to go. Okay. Yeah, I'm about halfway. I'm going to go refill my water real quick. I will be right back. And then we'll finish up this second half. So I'll be back in just a minute or two. Hey, Nambro! Team Never Tilt. How you doing? Good to see you. We're about halfway through the second chapter for the night. I'm just going to go get some water, and I will be right back. Okay. Like I said, I just wanted to get some water. So, all right, let's get through this. The making of a king. As we have shown, Freemasonry has many elements within that are very Egyptian. From the use of pyramids to the Eye of Amun-Ra, but nobody believes that there is any connection. The oral traditions of Freemasonry date the founding of the ritual to be some 4,000 years ago, but nobody believes it to be true. But with the possible ancient Egyptian origin of the pillars and the identical nature of Maat, we were certainly starting to believe that there was a connection. The starting place for looking for further evidence of similarity of rituals had to be the proceedings of the king and his court. When the ruler of the two lands died, he became Osiris, and his son immediately became Horus and the new king. When the king had no son, the gods could be relied upon to solve the problem. However, we believe that it was the Royal Lodge members who made the decisions, and once the initiation of the new master was complete, the Horus was beyond competition for all time. One such occasion followed the death of Thutmosis II in 1504 BC. He had a daughter by his wife Hatshepsut, but his only son was by a concubine called Isis. This boy succeeded in becoming Thutmosis III and told the strange story of how the god Amun had chosen him as the new ruler of the two lands. As a young boy, he was being prepared for the priesthood and attended the great temple that the master builder Ineni had erected for his grandfather. One day he was present when his father was offering a sacrifice to Amun, and the god was brought into the hall of cedar columns carried within a boat shrine. The god was carried shoulder high round a circuit of the hall. The boy quite properly prostrated himself on the floor with his eyes closed, but as the shrine reached him, the god forced the procession to stop by, increasing his weight so that so the bearers had to lower the god to the floor. The boy found he had been raised to his feet, and at that moment he knew that he had been chosen as the Horus to be, even while his father was still alive. This story bears a very strong resemblance to the behavior attributed to Yahweh when he was being carried in the ark, his boat shrine, by the Israelites. This started us looking at the book of Exodus in a new light, and we began to see just how Egyptian the whole story of Moses and his Israelites really is. In our opinion, the coronation ceremony of the new Horus, the incoming king, was also the funeral ceremony for the new Osiris, the outgoing king. These events were conducted in secret and were restricted to the inner sanctum of very senior officials, the Grand Lodge. These obviously included the high priest and the immediate male members of the royal family, but master builders, senior scribes, and army generals may also have been included. The funerary liturgy itself was not recorded, but a large amount of the procedure has been pieced together to paint a very illuminating picture. We found it significant that the ascension of the coronation and the coronation were quite separate events. The ascension was normally at first light on the day after the old king's death, but the coronation was celebrated some considerable time later. Despite the extensive records made by the Egyptians, no full account of an Egyptian coronation has ever been found, which suggests that the important parts were entirely a secret ritual transmitted to a tiny group by verbal means alone. The king-making ritual is known to have been performed in the Pyramid of Unas, as in a Masonic temple. The ceiling of the main chamber represents the sky with stars in place. The commonly accepted view is that the ceremony was celebrated on the last night of the waning moon, beginning at sunset and continuing all night until sunrise. The purpose being a resurrection ritual which identified the dead king with Osiris. Resurrection ceremonies were not reserved for the death of the king. Indeed, they appear to have been quite frequent events conducted in the mortuary temple. It has been suggested that these were rituals to honor royal ancestors, but could it be they were admission ceremonies for new members of the royal inner sanctum, where they were figuratively resurrected before being admitted to the secrets and mysteries, quote unquote, handed down by word of mouth from the time of the gods? It is clear that these secrets would, by definition, require a secret society, a privileged group that constituted a society apart. Such a group would have to have had a ceremony of entry. No ancient or even modern elite institution ever fails to have a ceremony of passing from the rank and file into the restricted group. At the coronation/funeral ritual, the old king was resurrected as the new one and proved himself a suitable candidate by traveling around the perimeter of the entire country. This was really a symbolic act, as the new king was conducted around the temple room to show himself a worthy candidate to those present, which included the god Re and his main assistant. In a Masonic ceremony too, the new member is conducted around the temple to prove himself a worthy candidate. After passing all points of the compass, he is presented in the south, west, and finally the east. The first is the junior warden, said to represent the moon. Thoth was god of the moon. The next is the senior warden, representing the sun, Re. Wow, I'm reading this terribly tonight. I'm sorry. The next is the senior warden representing the sun. Re was the god of the sun. And finally, the worshipful master, who could be said to represent the risen Osiris. Like the Egyptians, Freemasons conduct their ceremonies at night. The similarities are striking, but what evidence did we have that a secret society existed at all, let alone that the principles of the coronation ceremony extended to the initiation of members? There are many inscriptions indicating a select group whose membership was given knowledge of secret things. An inscription on a false door, now in the Cairo Museum, was written by someone who had been surprised and honored to be admitted to the inner group of King Teti. It reads as follows, quote, "Today, in the presence of the son of Re, Teti, living forever, high priest of Ptah, more honored by the king than any servant, as master of secret things of every work which his majesty should be done, pleasing the heart of his lord every day, high priest of Ptah Sabu, high priest of Ptah, cupbearer of the king, master of secret things of the king in his every place, when his majesty favored me, his majesty caused that I enter into the privy chamber, that I might set for him the people into every place where I found the way. Never was done the like to any servant like me by any sovereign, because his majesty loved me more than any servant of his. Because I was honored in his heart, I was useful in his majesty's presence. I found a way in every secret matter of the court. I was honored in his majesty's presence." End quote. Sorry, that was a tough one to read for some reason. The language, I guess. We'll just chalk it up as that. This person obviously felt his preferment to this exalted group was very unusual for someone holding his original rank, which indicates that while senior individuals probably had a right to membership, the king and possibly others had the authority to introduce selected people. Egyptologists have never found an explanation for the expression, "I found the way," in reference to secret matters, but we could interpret this as being instructed in secret knowledge that would thereafter become a way of life. An important point is that the Essenes and Jerusalem Church used the same term for the following of their law. Another inscription refers to an unknown builder who was also a member of King Teti's secret holding group. Quote, "I did so that his majesty praised me on account of it. His majesty caused that I enter into the privy chamber and that I become a member of the sovereign's court. His majesty sent me to conduct the works in the Ka temple and in the quarry of Troya. I made a false door conducting their work." End quote. The 19th century translation "privy chamber" was selected because it described the modern understanding of a king's personal room, but that does not sit with the term sovereign's court, which implies the whole of the palace entourage. Perhaps it could be expressed more meaningfully as, "His Majesty caused that I enter the royal chamber of restricted access, that I might be made a member of the king's elite." As we have seen, there was instruction in secret practices for this elite, which must have been bestowed in a ceremony concealed from the view of lesser individuals. This would have represented the highest level of attainment for a man, but for a man who was also a god, the Horus, there was a far more special event, the making of a king. It was an enormously important occasion, representing the continued binding of the two lands and the prosperity and stability that they enjoyed. However, between the death of the old king and the confirmation of the new one was a point of danger, as it allowed an opportunity for insurrection. The Egyptologist H. W. Fairman observed, quote, "It is quite evident that at some point in the making of a king, in his selection or his crowning, something happened that ensured his legitimacy, that automatically disarmed opposition and claimed and obtained loyalty, and that simultaneously made him a god and linked him directly with Egypt's past. End quote. Sorry. Okay. I think. How much farther do we have? Okay, 118. Okay. Okay. I know it will not stop itching tonight. I don't know why. Okay. Here we go. This view is widely shared, but until now, no specific evidence has come to light to identify this key event within the ceremony. In the light of our wider research, a new and startling theory about the special nature of king-making in ancient Egypt occurred to us. We will start by reviewing what is known of the king-making process. The coronation took place in two stages. The first stage included anointing and an investiture with a ceremonial collar and apron, as well as a presentation of an ankh, symbol of life, and 4 posies. In the second stage, royal insignia were presented, and the main ritual began. A crucial part of this was the reaffirmation of the union of the two lands and the investiture of the new king by presenting 2 distinctly different crowns and regalia. At what stage in these proceedings the king became a god is never stated. We would suggest that the central and crucial process of king-making involved the candidate traveling to the stars to be admitted a member of the Society of Gods and there to be made the Horus, possibly being spiritually crowned by the dead king, the new Osiris. At some point in the events of the night, the old king and the new king journeyed to the constellation of Orion together, one to remain in his celestial home and one to return to rule the land of men. The new king would have undergone death, quote unquote, by means of a potion administered by him to him by the high priest in the gathering of the inner group of the holders of the royal secrets. This drug would have been a hallucinogenic that slowly induced a catatonic state, leaving the new king as inert as any corpse. As the hours of the night passed, the potion would have worn off, and the newly made Horus would have returned from his sojourn with the gods and past kings of Egypt. The return would have been carefully calculated so that the new king returned to consciousness precisely as the morning star rose above the horizon. From that moment on, no mortal would ever think about usurping his power, divinely given in a council of the gods in the heavens above. Once the members of the king's elite, the holders of secrets, had decided whom to raise to the sublime and unique degree of Horus, the time for any possible competition had passed. This logical theory meets all academic criteria for the unknown part of the ceremony that made the new king unassailable. This process would have 1. Disarmed opposition and ensured total loyalty. 2. Made the new king a god. Obviously, no man could have conferred this status. And 3. Linked him directly with Egypt's past. He had sojourned with all past kings, proving the unprovable. If we had just discovered a new chamber in one of the pyramids and on its walls found a full inscription of this king-making process, we would have enough proof for most, but no doubt not all, academics to accept our theory as viable. That is not the case, and clearly is not going to happen. The record of events would no more include details of potions administered to the king-to-be than they would give details of the embalming chemistry used on the dead king. As far as the hieroglyphics' failure to record that the candidate for kingship underwent a temporary death and traveled to the stars is concerned, we would say that the main event was the creation of the Osiris and the creation of the Horus. What? Was an oh. Okay, so let me reread that. we would say that the main event was the creation of the Osiris, and the creation of the Horus was an implicit event within that. There is some strong circumstantial evidence to support this theory. Before we go into the reasons why we think this theory is correct, we would like to remind you of the point regarding our two-tier approach to our research. In following this system, we have consistently not ignored any proven facts and have clearly indicated when we have been speculating. In contrast to a number of the other new ideas that we put forward in this book, we cannot provide absolute proof for this process of king-making, but it is a theory that fits the gap in the known Egyptian king-making process, one that is supported by such facts as there are. The silent evidence. Many people have an impression that the ancient Egyptians built pyramids for the burial of their pharaohs. In fact, the age in which pyramids were built was very short indeed, and it will probably come as a surprise to most readers to learn that Queen Cleopatra was closer in time to the space shuttle technicians than she was to the builders of the Great Pyramid. It is also far from certain that the primary purpose of the pyramids was to provide burial places for dead kings, and the subject of their true meaning is still widely debated. A useful analogy is that St. Paul's Cathedral is not the tomb of Sir Christopher Wren, despite the fact that he is buried within it. The major source of information about the Osiris/Horus ritual comes from inscriptions called the Pyramid Texts, found inside the 5 pyramids of Saqqara near Cairo, the most important of which was that of King Unas, which dates from the end of the 5th dynasty of kings. Although this is around 4,300 years old, it still ranks as a very late pyramid. But the ritual described is considered to be as much as 5,300 years old. Study of these texts has produced a reconstruction of some of the elements of the ritual, but it is what is missing that is most telling. This reconstruction describes the various chambers, ascribing ritual meaning to each. The burial chamber represents the underworld, the antechamber the horizon or upper world, and the ceiling the night sky. The coffin containing the body of the dead king was brought into the burial chamber where the ritual was performed. The body was placed into the sarcophagus, and the members of the elite passed into the antechamber, breaking 2 red vases as they went. During the ceremony, the Ba, the soul, of the dead king left the body and crossed the underworld, the burial chamber, and then, acquiring tangible form in the statue of himself, proceeded to cross the night sky and reach the horizon where all joined the Lord of all. The process was then repeated in abbreviated form. For whom, we wondered? The candidate king, perhaps? The most tantalizing aspect of this interpretation of the pyramid text of Unas is that it contains another ritual running alongside the main ritual. This was a silent ritual concerned with something like resurrection. It seems to have been observed alongside part of the spoken ritual, starting as the celebrants passed from the burial chamber into the antechamber with the breaking of the red vases. The only tentative explanation for this parallel ritual has been that it was for Upper Egypt, whereas the spoken one was for the more important Lower Egypt. Instead, we wondered if it could have been for the transportation of the temporarily dead candidate king, who would have to be resurrected back into human form before the temple was sealed. The same ceremonies are known to have been conducted in identical form in other periods, and many experts believe that the ritual is more ancient than the oldest Egyptian history, which is taken to be around 3200 BC. A prayer from a 6th dynasty, 2345 to 2181 BC, pyramid expresses the spirit of the ancient Egyptian theology that was built upon resurrection to the stars and the maintenance of stability on earth. And then we have another long quote here. Bear with me. Quote, "Thou standest on protected, equipped as a god, equipped with the aspect of Osiris on the throne of the first of the Westerners. Thou doest what he was wont to do among the spirits, the imperishable stars. Thy son stands on thy throne, equipped with thy aspect. He does what thou wast wont to do aforetime at the head of the living by the command of Re, the great god. He cultivates barley, he cultivates spelt, that he may present thee therewith. Hon, all life and dominion are given to thee. Eternity is thine, says Re. Thou thyself speakest when thou hast received the aspect of a god, and thou art great thereby among the gods who are in the estate. Hon, thy Ba stands among the gods, among the spirits. Fear of thee is in their hearts. Hoen, this N, stands on thy throne at the head of the living. Terror of thee is in their hearts. Thy name that is on earth lives. Thy name that is on earth endures. Thou wilt not perish. Thou wilt not be destroyed forever and ever." End quote. Sorry, some of that language is a little tough for me to read. Consider how a silent prayer for the candidate king about to undergo his brief death to pass through the underworld and meet with the past kings. Consider now. To meet with the past kings of the two lands. Quote, "Almighty and eternal Re, architect and ruler of the universe, at whose creative fiat all things first were made, we, the frail creatures of thy providence, humbly implore thee to pour down upon this convocation assembled in thy holy name the continued dew of thy blessing. More especially we beseech thee to impart thy grace to this thy servant who seeks to partake with us the secrets of the stars. And do him with such fortitude that in the hour of trial he fail not, but passing safely under thy protection through the dark valley of the shadow of death, he may finally rise from the tomb of transgression to shine as the stars forever and ever." End quote. It seems to fit perfectly, doesn't it? Yet this is no ancient Egyptian ritual. It is the prayer offered up in the Masonic third-degree ceremony prior to the candidate undergoing a figurative death to be resurrected a Master Mason. We have simply changed the name God to Re and Secrets of a Master Mason to Secrets of the Stars to make our point. Otherwise, it is unchanged. What then of the suggestion that a narcotic drug was employed to transport the new king to the stars and back again? As we have already stated, there would be no record of this potion, as there is no real record of the coronation ritual at all. It seems reasonable that there is no record of the massively important moment of king-making because no one knew what it was. The candidate took the potion, traveled to the stars, and returned to the king and Horus. All his earthly team had to do was present him with the trappings of office, and ask no questions about the business of the gods, of which the king was now one. The king himself would no doubt have had strange dreams under the influence of the drug, but was not, of course, going to reveal anything. By this process, the king-making ceremony put the new Horus beyond all dispute as the divine choice of the gods as ruler of the two lands. Narcotic drugs have been used in religious ceremonies in almost every ancient human culture, and it would be surprising if such an advanced culture as that of the early Egyptians did not possess very sophisticated knowledge concerning this use. The question is not could they have used such drugs, it is why do we think that they would not have used them. The expected method for a man to reach the heavens in death was to traverse the bridge in life, usually with the aid of narcotics. Quote, the funerary bridge, a link between the earth and heaven, which human beings use to communicate with the gods, is a common symbol of ancient religious practices. At some point in the distant past, such bridges had been in common use, but following the decline of man, it has become more difficult to use such bridges. People can only cross the bridge in spirit, either as a dead soul or in a state of ecstasy. But a crossing would be fraught with difficulty. Not all souls would succeed, as demons and monsters could beset those who were not properly prepared. Only the good and the skilled adepts who already knew the road from a ritual death and resurrection could cross the bridge easily. End quote. And that is Mircea Eliade, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. I don't like Mircea Eliade. I never did. Opinions vary. Some people praise him like he's just the be-all, end-all of certain aspects of anthropology, and I just can't stand him. These ideas on shamanism fit what we know of Egyptian beliefs on every level. Demons were warded from the passage of the Osiris by spoken curses, but in fact his course would be quite safe for two reasons. First, he lived by Ma'at, and so was a good man. Secondly, he knew the way from traveling the bridge when he was made Horus. Perhaps the passage of the new king was conducted in silence so as not to alert demons. The new king could then follow the dead king across the heavens, learning the way so that he could in turn lead the next king at his own death. We later found that Henry Frankfurt had detected that the rebirth rites for the dead king were conducted in parallel with the coronation rituals of his heir. This confirmed our view of a double ceremony for the dead and the living kings. Furthermore, the passage from the pyramid text shows that the new Horus was considered to be the morning star when the new Osiris says, quote, the reed boats of the sky are set in place for me, that I may cross by means of them to Re at the horizon. I will stand among them, for the moon is my brother, the morning star is my offspring. Okay, we're getting closer. We believe that the Egyptians adopted much of their theology and technology from the secrets of the city builders of Sumer, and that the Sumerians were extremely well versed in the use of drugs for religious purposes. The next question we had to consider was whether or not such resurrection rituals were exclusively reserved for coronations. The answer seemed to be no, they were not. By the end of the Old Kingdom, circa 2181 BC, some form of royal resurrection ceremony was known to be held annually, and as the Middle Kingdom progressed, the ritual is known to have been applied to well-to-do people, possibly outside the king's central group. These non-royal people would almost certainly not have had the secret knowledge of the royal group. The morning star shines again. Now we need to consider a vital element of Egyptian theology. As we said above, the theology of Egypt was very much a development of Sumerian beliefs. Moreover, future Hebrew and therefore Christian beliefs were a development of Egyptian theology, remerged with later Babylonian versions of the same source material. We had already come across a common identification of the morning star as the symbol of rebirth in the Essene community / Jerusalem Church and Freemasonry. We now found the theme again in ancient Egypt. Pyramid texts 357, 929, 935, and 1707 refer to the dead king's offspring, the Horus, as being the morning star. It is interesting to note that the Egyptian hieroglyphic for the morning star was the lateral has the literal meaning divine knowledge. This seems to support our thesis that the candidate for kingship was raised to the status of new god slash king Horus by sharing the secrets of the gods in the land of the dead, where he learned the great secrets before returning to earth as the morning star broke the horizon just before sunrise. And now there's a little illustration here, hieroglyph for the morning star. Nothing much. Okay. As we were working in this phase of our research, a new book was published which claimed to throw new light on the purpose of the pyramids by detailing their astrologically inspired design. Robert Bovell and Adrian Gilbert put forward a well-argued and researched case that shows how the Giza pyramids are arranged in a deliberate imitation of the stars of Orion's belt. They also make reference to the rituals that were conducted in this stepped ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia involving the morning star, seen as the great cosmic goddess Ishtar. This evidence from a totally different route confirmed what had been found independently by working backwards from the rituals of modern Freemasonry. In Egypt, the new king, the Horus, is the morning star, arising, like the raised Freemason, from a temporary and figurative death. The morning star, usually identified with Venus, was proving itself to be a very important link in our chain. But, however fascinating were the parallels of the Essenes and Freemasonry, which we discovered in Egyptian practices, there remained an obvious question. Was there a route for the ideals of Ma'at, the secrets of the Egyptian kings, and a detailed resurrection ritual to get through to the Essenes? To find out, we needed to look more closely at the Osiris story. The particular fate of Osiris, his brutal murder and dismemberment by his brother Set, followed by his resurrection and exaltation to the stars, is a very early example of the vindication and reward of innocent suffering. Osiris's fate gave hope to the lower orders of society and gave a meaning and a purpose to suffering. The cult of Osiris came to be a benign funerary cult, accessible to the ordinary Egyptian. When other gods remained remote in their temples, Osiris could be worshipped anywhere by anybody alongside the local god. Change the fate to his crucifixion, and this description could be about Jesus the Christ. We now felt positive that we would find the connections we suspected to exist. We did not have to wait long for a powerful hypothesis to emerge. As we were in the midst of analyzing the next key period of Egyptian history, the central character of our research, Hiram Abif, emerged out of the mists of time to confront us. And then we are at the conclusion for this chapter. Woo! Conclusion. We felt at the very least that it was probable the first Egyptian builders had originated in Sumer and that these Sumerian immigrants had brought technology and theology to Egypt. The fledgling Egyptian civilization was well established by about 3100 BC, and the two kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt had already been twinned as two halves of a new single state. This unification of two kingdoms with one divine ruler was to prove important for our investigations developed. The king's right to rule was based on the story of the murder of Osiris by Set and told of how Isis reconstructed Osiris's body and then had a son, Horus, by him. Horus went on to take the kingdoms of Egypt back from Set in a mighty battle. Each king thereafter was considered to be an incarnation of Horus, literally the son of God. When the king died, he merged with Osiris, God the Father, and went to live in the kingdom of the dead, and his son became Horus, the next living God king. We had detected that the security of the whole state depended on the two kingdoms working together, and this cooperation was symbolized by two pillars, one in the north and one in the south, united by a heavenly crossbeam forming a doorway facing the rising sun. This powerful concept of strength through the unity of two pillars is still a central theme of Masonic ritual and was a theme with which we felt very familiar. This was not the only link we had found with modern Freemasonry. The concept of Ma'at, meaning righteousness, truth, and justice, within a level and ordered symmetrical scheme, summed up the principles we had learnt as Freemasons. This humanistic ethical code was not a religious commandment, and neither was it a legal requirement. It was a goodness freely given for its own sake. We knew that Freemasonry could not have copied this idea from Egyptian history because the concept of Ma'at, long lost to the world, remained so until the decoding of the Rosetta Stone. This stone, which opened the way to translating the hitherto incomprehensible Egyptian hieroglyphics, was not found until nearly 100 years after the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England. At this point, we had established two circumstantial links with Freemasonry. Firstly, there was the hint of a resurrection ceremony connected to the Osiris legend, and secondly, Ma'at, at first a great truth and later a goddess, was sister to Thoth, the god of the moon, and another figure of great significance in Masonic myth. Whilst investigating the king-making ceremony, we had found that although the funerary liturgy itself was not recorded, it involved a resurrection ritual which identified the dead king with Osiris. We also found evidence that suggested that similar ceremonies were much more widely used than just at the making of a king, and that they seemed to involve a secret society. The evidence of this secret society we found in translations of inscriptions on artifacts in Cairo Museum, text which, again, could not have been translated prior to the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which happened long after Freemasonry had publicly announced itself. With the added insight of our Masonic training, we had been able to attempt a reconstruction of the Egyptian king-making ceremony which fitted all the known facts. The most exciting link with the Masonic third degree came from references in the pyramid text to the king representing the morning star, which had been such an important part of our own Masonic raising ceremonies. The Egyptian hieroglyphic for the morning or divine star was the same five-pointed star used to represent the 5 points of fellowship of the Masonic third degree. This obviously encouraged us to investigate the Egyptian connection more closely because although we had suspicions, we lacked proof of any practices that were unarguably Masonic. Whew, we made it. That was the end of that chapter. So that will lead us into chapter 8 for next time. Take those damn glasses off. 8 and 9 for next time. Hopefully the chapters will be a little bit shorter next time, but regardless, I'm going to keep up with the 2 chapter each reading that we've been doing. So yeah, well, my 2 favorite streamers are here with me, so there's nobody to really go out and raid, so I'm just going to call it there for the night. I'm tuckered out anyway, so I will see you all in the Friday reading in the same book, the Hiram Key. Okay, so have a good night.
Shattered skies, watching teary blue eyes, wonder where I might find some peace of mind. Not lights like I had, but more sophisticated into love.